Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, RegisKillbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and I want to talk about some legendary spells. Now, the Boomsday Project, the new expansion for Hearthstone, was just revealed, and in that reveal, we saw Myra's Unstable Element, the first real, true legendary spell for a class. We've seen quests before, which are kind of like legendary spells, but these are real legendary spells. They're not all 1 mana. They don't have that specific quest designation. Myra's Unstable Element, absolutely crazy effect, as you might expect from a legendary spell. Also, something we've seen is that this has a named character featured in it, which is a little bit unusual. Usually spells just describe the thing that is happening. So what I think we're going to see across all legendary spells in the Boomsday is the fact that it's probably one of Dr. Boom's scientists that were teased in the reveal trailer, and some kind of contraption they've made or something they're doing, and that's referenced here, and you'll see will soon be referenced in 8 custom cards I'm about to propose that might just be what the rest of the legendary spells look like. So I'm going to take my best guess at what Blizzard might want to do for the 8 remaining classes whose legendary spells we've yet to see. Now, are these going to be the end result? Almost certainly not. The odds of me getting anything close to correct are pretty darn small, but it's still really fun to explore these ideas and look at the sorts of things that Blizzard might want to be doing and have fun talking about why I think these would be good for the game or interesting mechanics to explore. That said, let's go ahead and jump into my 8 potential legendary spells for the Boomsday Project. Up first here we have Luna's Telescope, and that's because Luna is one of the cards that we've already seen for a scientist for Dr. Boom. And with this one, I wanted to explore the space of what would a cheap legendary spell look like. It's really easy to think about like huge, giant, affecting 10 mana spells that are just going to do all kinds of crazy stuff. But I figured not every spell is going to be enormous, and some might in fact be rather cheap. So we have the legendary scientist Luna here. Mage is legendary. And we have her Telescope, because she's all about telescopes. And this 2-mana spell reads, see the 3 cards on the left side of your opponent's hand, and then choose one of those to add to the bottom of their deck. So the legendary minion Luna is all about the cards on the right side of your hand, but I figured if she's got a telescope, if she's a stargazer, she's often looking across, looking away from herself, looking far away towards your opponent's hand as well. So not only is she looking into your own deck, but your opponent's stuff. And my thought was, why not create essentially a combo deck disruptor? Not something that necessarily outright breaks combo decks, not that that would be bad, but just something that stalls them or delays them. And often in a combo deck, if your opponent keeps cards in the mulligan, or if they just have a few key combo cards they're holding on to while playing other stuff, those cards often start to drift towards the left side of their hand because they've been holding on to them for such a long time. They don't have any reason to play them, so they tend to move over. So if you cast Luna's Telescope in the mid to late game, I think you're pretty likely to find something very important that your opponent has been storing up. And if you're able to take that card and move it to the bottom of their deck, you're not destroying it, you're just hiding it for a while, then you're going to disrupt their combo for a much longer period than they otherwise might have expected. They might have only been 1 turn or 1 card away, and now suddenly they're 5 turns or 5 cards away. And since this card doesn't technically really do anything, and in a lot of matchups it'd just be completely dead, like in an aggro deck, just probably wouldn't do anything at all. That's why I decided I made it cheap. It's just a stall. It's not a removal. It's not immediately impacting the board or anything like that. So it's a fairly low tempo card in a lot of ways. Just one that's designed to answer certain kinds of things. So not every mage would want to run this necessarily, but it could still be a cool disruption and a good instance of a cheap legendary spell, which again is pretty hard to design. So moving on to this next card, I've already kind of cheated against the premise, which is that this should really be called Electra's Bottled Lightning, because we've already seen the legendary minion for Shaman, which is Electra Storm Surge. And much like Luna the Stargazer, that is apparently a scientist for Dr. Boom. But I found this artwork that is just so stupidly perfect for this card's design and name that I just had to say screw it. I know it's going to be Electra, but I just made up a name for this one because the artwork here is too perfect. It's even a shaman because he's wearing mail, and it's lightning, which is a shaman thing. So this was just something I could not live without. So pretend it's an artwork of Electra and pretend the name is Electra if that's going to bother you. Otherwise, here we have Lix Bottled Lightning, a 4-mana spell for Shaman. This is another one I wanted to play around in that space where it's a little bit cheaper. And for Bottled Lightning, this card will replay the last 3 battle cries that your opponent triggered. So, for instance, any small random thing, if you're playing a Zoo Warlock, for instance, and they played 2 Flame Imps and a Kobold Librarian, when you cast Lix Bottled Lightning, you would take 8 damage to your face and draw a card. So it probably wouldn't be very good. And in a lot of instances, it's going to be pretty neutral. It's just going to do, maybe draw a card. It's not going to do anything super exciting. It would be a fine 4-mana play because some battle cries just probably don't contribute to your game plan, or they're not doing anything super exciting. They're just impacting the board in small ways, or in fact, because if they do damage or anything, if it's all flame elementals of your opponent's side of the board, the random target aspect could even hurt you or backfire. But, of course, this is another card that's designed to target certain things, because if your opponent plays big, crazy, insane battle cries like Shudderwalk, suddenly your Lix Bottled Lightning becomes much, much, much crazier. And it's not just Shudderwalk, right? There are other examples of big, powerful battle cries. And in fact, often 3 of them in a row could do some substantial stuff as well. So imagine, Archbishop Benedictus, if that were a battle cry, you could just copy the deck right back. That would be nuts. So it gives you this sort of counter, or at least counterplay to your opponent playing all kinds of battle cry stuff. And right now, we don't have answers to battle cries or counters to battle cries in Hearthstone. You're kind of just helpless when a big battle cry happens. There's no way to preempt that or ruin it. It's just something that's going to go off. And this still wouldn't preempt it or ruin it, but it would at least give you a cheap way to punish it almost, or return it in favor for only 4 mana, which sometimes could be huge, particularly because there's only 3 battle cries here. So yes, this would be a powerful play. It's supposed to. It's a legendary minion. It would be a cheap play, but it wouldn't always be good. And sometimes dead cards that don't do anything are really risky to run and include a lot of opportunity cost in different matchups. So I do think it remains balanced. Just because it's only going to be great some of the time, it's not going to be great all of the time. But when it's good, it's really good. And I love the idea that you're capturing this moment in a bottle, this crazy moment, but it only lasts for a little while. And if you don't play Lix Bottled Lightning fast enough, or if you try to get too greedy with it, it can backfire in some really big ways. So very interesting strategic elements added into the play of this card and the success of this card. When to use it, when to hold it, all of that stuff, I think makes it both balanced, but also very tactically rewarding, which we don't see enough of in Hearthstone either. So up next here we have a Druid spell, and this is the first 10 mana one. I think there might be a couple other ones, or maybe just a couple high cost ones. This is Freywind's Fertilizer, and this one I designed to be a little weaker than the rest, but strong in one specific direction. So certainly not every Druid would want to run this card. I think Druid has too many good cards right now, too much crazy stuff they can do. So I very intentionally left this one what I think is a little bit lower on the power level side of things. Some people will probably disagree, but let's talk about it. In this card, this allows you to increase your maximum mana crystals to 12. So as it stands right now, you can't get above 10 mana in any class or any scenario. If you innervate at 10 mana, it just dissipates and you stay at 10 mana. You can't get to 11. Now, of course, you can spend mana and then innervate and get back. You can spend more than 10 mana in any given turn, also with things like Twig of the World Tree, of course. But this would put your maximum mana crystals at 12, so you'd start with 12. And those 2 extra mana crystals would essentially be there at the beginning of every turn. Once you filled them in, it would take 2 turns after Freywind's Fertilizer to do that. You'd go to 11, and then you'd go to 12. But essentially, it just gives you more leeway and more room to work. And I think that the most important and powerful utilization of that would be in some sort of combo deck with something like Malygos, for instance. So right now, when you're capped at 10 mana with Malygos, it can be hard to line everything up and put all the pieces together. If you have 12 mana, suddenly you could do more interesting things with like 2 Innervates, for instance, or a Biology Project, the new card from Boomsday Project. Maybe it'd be easier to squeeze in an Ixlid and a Swipe and who knows what else. Suddenly options exist. But of course, you're paying a pretty big penalty to set that up because you have to take a 10 mana turn that's just a complete pass. You're not going to do anything else. You're spending 10 mana for this future investment that you may not pay off 5-10 turns down the road, who knows? And in the meantime, your opponent is doing something cool and awesome and perhaps trying to kill you. So it's a big cost, passing basically almost an entire turn just to pull this off and set up for later. That's a high price to pay. Now, it does allow you to do something very cool and unique that would otherwise be impossible, but it comes at a big downside and big risk. So I think that's where this stays balanced. So even if it does empower some really cool combo deck, it hurts them in a way as well. And although Malygos Druid is already kind of good, it's because of Twig of the World Tree that it's so strong. And I don't think this changes that Twig of the World Tree interaction all that much. Of course, you could still squeeze out some extra things from Twig of the World Tree because of this mana increase, but it's going to end the game in either scenario, right? And this doesn't necessarily help that. So this just helps a little bit in that combo direction. And of course, too, as it's a legendary spell, the odds of drawing it are pretty slim. It could always be at the bottom of your deck. So all of those different aspects that increase or decrease the competitive viability of this card over a huge sample size of games means it's hard to work with. It's almost more fun or more meme oriented as opposed to just super competitively good. Now, I know everybody in the comments going to go find some insane combo that will make this overpowered. I encourage you to do that. That's awesome. I obviously haven't had the time to sit down and think about every possible interaction that this could create. So maybe there's something that breaks this, but I don't think so. I think it's probably just an interesting, different little way to explore mana expansion in Druid that's probably, at the end of the day, not actually really all that good of a card because there's just so many problems trying to get it to work. So I'm pretty happy with how Freywind's Fertilizer turned out. So moving on here, let's talk about Warlock's potential legendary spell. This is Warpy's Portal Projector, a 4-mana spell that reads, open a portal to another dimension. Minions placed into it are summoned as random demons. So this would open up, one of those non-interactive circles we've seen with things like Shares in the Corpse Flower or the Darkness before he gets summoned. Some past Tavern Brawls, I think, and adventure bosses have implemented the same sort of thing. It's just a circle on the field that cannot be destroyed or removed or anything else. It's permanently there. For 4 mana, you're making that investment into this portal. And then anytime you placed a minion on the field over that portal, so it would have an interactable element this time where you could drop a minion into it, that minion would be summoned to the right of the portal as a demon, some kind of random demon. So it could be a Void Lord or it could be a Blood Imp. It's just going to be completely random. And I think this is another card that's not necessarily always the strongest because I feel like there'd be some challenges for a lot of decks to make this work. It has pretty big downside and risk when you summon 3 Blood Imps in a row. That's not going to be what you want from this. So that was by design. I think Warlock has a lot of really good stuff right now. They don't necessarily need some super powerful spell, but nonetheless, there might be a Zoo deck that could utilize this and make some big, crazy, swingy kinds of turns. The problem, of course, being that Zoo decks don't typically want to spend 4 mana to do nothing in a turn, particularly in the early to mid game. So this would only really be a strong play in the later portions of the game when said Zoo deck already has some spare mana laying around. When they get to that 7, 8, 9 mana spot and they're life tapping and they're playing a couple small minions and 4 mana is left over, that's when you'd play this. And that's when in the late game you're hoping to turn your Voidwalkers and Flame Imps into Void Lords. And sometimes it'll work and sometimes it won't, but you're still paying a tempo price and using a card in your deck that has a lot of opportunity cost because you're not playing it throughout the early to mid game when a Zoo deck would succeed the most. Now, as far as like a mid-range demon deck, that could be possible too. but again, you might get small stuff and backfire. So this requires some very interesting deck building requirements. You could try to go all in with a ton of 1-drops and just uproll everything into awesome Void Lords, but of course there's problems there, because what if you don't draw your War Piece Portal Projector? All kinds of issues, I think, help keep this in check, but it would still be super fun and very random, which Blizzard loves. Now, I don't necessarily love that randomness quite the same, but I do think this is the kind of card Blizzard would probably put into the game, and I don't think it'd be broken, and there might still be some kind of deck that could work around it, which would be pretty cool to see. And I just like the idea of opening up a portal using technology, and it maybe backfires sometimes, maybe it works sometimes, but there's a ton of demons popping out. And I guess there's one other implication of this, which is if you have something like Blood Reaver Gul'dan and you don't want to run a bunch of demons in your deck, this could give you a way to get demons into the pool for Gul'dan without actually running demons. So it might open up some deck building opportunities in that direction as well. All that said, I think War Piece Portal Projector is pretty cool, and I absolutely love the artwork here. It matches the theme of the Thunderstorm perfectly if you look closely, and I think it's pretty darn cool. So I'm happy with this one. So moving on here to the Priest spell, this one's had a lot of different iterations, a lot of changes, and I think it's really hard to design legendary spells for the record. So keep that in mind as we talk about this. I do think this is another spell where I probably tried to keep it in check a little bit and gave it a lot of downside and a lot of risk, and it would be more about fun perhaps, or at least it would be put into a deck with a very singular purpose, some sort of combo deck or deck designed to use it. It would certainly not fit into just any everyday deck. So this is Holford's Mind Melter. That's a little bit of a teaser there with Holford. That was the name of my original World of Warcraft character, which was a dwarf priest. So nice little Easter egg for everybody out there. And this reads, both players take fatigue damage at the start of their turn for the rest of the game. So essentially this would apply a damage over time effect to each character, where they'd take 1, and then they'd take 2, and then they'd take 3, and then they'd take 4, so on and so forth. But because it is technically fatigue damage, if they're also in fatigue, it would accelerate that even more. So for instance, if your opponent had 0 cards when you played this, when it passed back to their turn, they'd take 1 from Holford's Mind Melter, and then they'd take an additional 2 from their normal fatigue. And then when you pass it back to them again, they'd take 3, and then they'd take 4, all in a single turn. So it could ramp up really, really quickly if they're in the fatigue scenario. Even if they're not, it's putting the game in a very terminal end state. Like the game is going to end at some point relatively soon after you cast Holford's Mind Melter, because everybody's taking so much damage. So I think it presents this really neat race against time sort of effect, where the priest certainly has healing cards, so they try to outlast their opponent because everybody's taking fatigue. Your opponent does take it a turn sooner than you because this reads at the start of their turn, so that gives you a very slight advantage on top of the healing that you already have. Maybe that's enough to help you outrace your opponent. The problem, of course, is that you spent 10 mana to achieve this, so you passed a turn, which means your opponent gets to develop the board. They might get to do some damage to you to kick things off once they realize, oh my gosh, we're in a race right now. I got to start slamming face super hard. So you kind of give them a little bit of a head start from a mana or tempo standpoint, and then you hope to catch up and recover a little bit with a healing standpoint. And I love the idea that probably within 4 or 5, 6 turns, this game is going to be over, and it's going to require a lot of interesting decision making, crazy back and forth. I think everybody in some way or another likes those fatigue battles where you're trying to figure out how much health do I need to have, exactly what cards does he have, what do I need to do to make sure I'm alive before he dies. And this just presents that opportunity way more often. Now, specifically, if you did put this into a deck that's designed to last until fatigue, or never run out of cards, you can make sure that once your opponent goes into fatigue, that they're going to die faster by casting this, because of that double stacking up effect I talked about at the beginning of the card discussion here. So if you run into like that kind of deck, a fatigue deck that drains your opponent's cards, Holford's Mind Melter could be a big finisher, right? It becomes a really, really fast and scary pyroblast, essentially, that does way, way more damage. But you had to get the game into a state where you were able to play this first, which isn't always easy, because again, taking a pass on your turn is really hard to do sometimes. This is a very slow sort of play that only rewards you many, many turns ahead. So I like the idea of that quite a bit, and I think the symmetrical effect here is really cool for priests specifically because they have so many different ways to gain life and try to outlast this. So pretty crazy card and threatening, scary card, really big effect, but I think ultimately a pretty fun one and one that I wouldn't actually hate seeing in the game at all. So up next here, let's talk about Paladin, and this is Lorena's Bubble Matrix, because of course Paladins are all about bubbles and divine shields, but you never really get to put a bubble on your hero, and this isn't a true bubble or a true divine shield, which could have been possible. I could have designed a card that said, like, at the start of every turn, give your hero divine shield, but that's just so bad against, like, ping effects. Like, you could just ping off the divine shield with 1 damage, and you wouldn't really save all that much health at the end of the day. So I wanted something that was actually more universally defensive and really hard to deal with, and gave Paladin that late game survivability and late game depth that they just aren't utilizing right now, because it's all odd aggro Paladin at the moment. The last couple expansions, Paladin's been an incredibly fast deck with Murlocs, and even Paladin was a pretty fast deck, and Odd Paladin, of course, a super fast deck. But I miss the days of a defensive Paladin. I want Control Paladin to thrive once again, and I think a card like Lorena's Bubble Matrix could do that. And once again, a high-cost card. I think legendary spells are going to want to generally tend towards higher costs. And it reads, for the rest of the game, reduce all damage taken by half. Now, that would be damage to your hero specifically, not your minions. I would say minions if it was for minions. So, for instance, if your opponent here attacks you with a 5 damage minion, it would be reduced to half, which would be 2.5, but then it would be rounded up. And since this does say it's rounding up the reduction, you would reduce 3 damage and you would take 2 damage. If they attack you with a 6 attack minion, of course, you're going to take 3. If they hit with a fireball, you're going to take 3. So it makes it way harder for opponents to kill you. But, of course, in an aggro deck, if you're playing against an aggro deck, that is, you don't get to play this early. You might just die before you get to turn 9. But once you do, you get this entire extra layer of survivability, which is really, really powerful. But, you know, it's a scientist. They made a bubble here. This bubble matrix thing is protecting you. But it's not perfect, so it doesn't deny all damage and only denies half of it. That's the theme or the idea there. So is this balanced? I don't know. It might be too good, frankly. Like, it could just become impossible for some opponents to kill you. But as far as I'm concerned, that late game stabilization against aggro decks happens anyway. You usually just find a point against an aggro deck where it's impossible for them to win because you've walled up on taunts, you've healed beyond range, and they just don't have any ways to kill you. So I don't think Lorena's Bubble Matrix really changes that interaction where you shut out an aggro deck. Because if you play this on turn 9 against a full board of aggro, even if your damage is reduced in half, a lot of the times you would still die in those scenarios. So instead of dealing, 18 or something, they deal 9, but you're dead anyway because you've been overwhelmed. So I don't think this is like an ice block style card where it saves you from impending doom as much as it is this card that's designed to really stretch out games and perhaps answer combo decks specifically. So things that are like Shutterwalk, for instance, maybe where they're trying to kill you. But again, I don't even know if this would help against Shutterwalk because that's sort of an infinite amount of damage. It would only help a little bit. But any sort of freeze mage of old where they're trying to do 25 damage in a single turn, this could shut that out completely. And I think it's important to have answers to things like that, not necessarily in every deck, but just in the meta and available so that there's always this checks and balance system between archetypes and between classes and between decks at any given time, so that if some freeze mage style deck ever became really dominant and some burst combo damage deck was dominating the meta, a card like Lorena's Bubble Matrix could come up in the meta and start to deny that and balance the scales a little bit between those two sorts of things. So like the idea of this defensive Paladin. Is it too good? Maybe. Tell me in the comments. I don't know. Share your thoughts. I'm not really sure. Maybe it's not good enough. Who really knows? Sometimes it's hard to tell with these. But I like the idea of it, the theme of it. Maybe there's a better way to explore how this happens. But I think this would be a pretty fun card to play. And, of course, I like defensive decks and slow decks and control decks. So I would certainly give a shot for Control Paladin with something like this. It'd be really, really cool. So moving on to Hunter here, we have Susie's Super Squisher, a 6-mana spell, and it was really tempting to give Hunter damage for their legendary spell, because Hunter is such a damaging class. They're so aggressive. They have lots of ways to kill you. But instead, I wanted to shift gears a little bit and give Hunter a more defensive card, because Control Hunter is something that seems like we're so close to it and we're teetering on the edge of it, but we just can't quite get a Control Hunter to work. So I thought maybe a legendary spell that served as a better removal tool might help. So with Susie Super Squisher here from the artwork from the Boomsday Project, we have these giant gorilla arms essentially that look like they're pretty good at squishing stuff. And I thought, hey, if something gets squished, it probably goes from its normal stat line to 1/1. You just turn everything essentially into a 1/1 minion. And that's really good at denying pressure. For instance, if your opponent has a bunch of mid-range stuff, that's a good answer. It's not a polymorph because they don't get transformed. They retain their death rattles. They retain any sort of board-based buffs. But it is just a stall out and a removal tool. One in particular that I think synergizes really nicely with Hunter because of something like Unleash the Hounds. So you could turn your entire opponent's deck and minion, not deck, but minions on board into to 1/1s and then cast Unleash the Hounds, and you have a full board clear, assuming there's no sort of death rattle shenanigans going on. So a nice immediate interaction with Unleash the Hounds. Also something we've seen before with like Hunter's Mark, where we reduce the health of our minions. This is kind of like a universal Hunter's Mark in a way that could be used across the entire board. It's not as good as a removal card like Twisting Nether, for instance, of course, because the minions don't go away. They're still there. They still retain all their effects. So it's just sort of a middle of the road control tool. It's not the best removal in the game, but it's still certainly very efficient, particularly against certain kinds of bigger boards. And since it synergizes with things like Rexar as well, that would have to be a 2-turn play. But still, if you're only taking 7 damage per turn, you can afford to leave a bunch of small minions on the board after something like Susie Super Squisher, and then come along and clean them up later as you move into a more defensive game plan. So I just like the idea, giving Hunter something defensive, slower, control-oriented. It's not amazing necessarily. It's good. It's strong, don't get me wrong, but it's not like that perfect removal spell that we've seen in the past. It's not as efficient necessarily as some other removal spells or combos like Equality, Consecration, or something like that. But it's still good for Hunter and better than what they've had in the past, and thematically I think fits the artwork here of one of the scientists I believe to be teased from the Doomsday. Who knows what her name will end up being or what the effect will be, but I thought this was a pretty cool way to combine the artwork and the effect into something that makes sense for Hunter and aligns in a little bit of a different direction than what we've traditionally seen for Hunter in the past. So that is Susie's Super Squisher. And then finally, I saved the most triggering card for last. Trigger being a little bit of a pun here, because this is Boom's Big Red Button. And as we know, Dr. Boom, Mad Genius, was teased as a hero card for Warrior, so I'm assuming there won't be any Scientist Legendary Minion for Warrior, and instead Dr. Boom will serve that role. And of course, the spell then would connect to Dr. Boom himself. And in the artwork here, for Dr. Boom, as you can also see in the lower right-hand corner, there's that image of him getting ready to push this trigger, this big red button, and the big red button was teased a bit too in the reveal trailer. So I thought it'd be fun to explore what would Dr. Boom do if he were gonna push a big red button. What dastardly, evil, villainous thing would he achieve with this big red button? And I thought, well, he'd probably just blow some stuff up, because Dr. Boom is all about bombs and boom bots and everything else. So what would he blow up? Well, maybe he'd blow up both people's decks, or at the very least, a big chunk of them. So Boom's Big Red Button, a 5-mana spell that destroys the top 5 cards from both players' decks. And that's going to make a lot of people who play things like Shutterwalk or Hadronox really mad right off the bat, because this means there's a very, very good chance that this card could destroy your opponent's combo piece. And I know that that would make you really sad if you played Shutterwalk or if you played Hadronox or Malagos or some other combo tool. But again, like I teased a little bit in a previous card, I think it's important to have answers to those sorts of things, just to keep that side of the meta in check. Because frankly, if you're playing this against an aggro deck, this card does nothing. The game is going to be over against an aggro deck in one of two ways. They're going to run you over and kill you long before any sort of fatigue consideration is at all relevant, or you're going to stabilize as a slower control style deck, and they're never going to kill you because you're just going to win the board and you're going to have enough life and the game will end that way. Never do you go to fatigue against an aggro deck as a control deck, or if you do, it's very, 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 very rarely. So essentially in like half of all Hearthstone matchups, this is just a dead card, and you have to run a card that doesn't help your game plan at all, and frankly, as a control deck against an aggro deck, might even hurt your game plan, because you might destroy life gain, or destroy taunts, or destroy something that you really need, so you're sitting on this completely dead card. But then, it is a tech card, essentially, against other kinds of matchups where you can disrupt your opponent's game plan in a really big way, and that gives you a chance to beat decks like Shutterwalk that might otherwise be impossible for a control warrior to deal with, because right now, Control Warrior just can't beat Shutterwalk. Like, they don't have enough aggression. Quest Warrior theoretically can because of the hero power, of course. That can provide them a lot of pressure, that 8 damage over time. But a just traditional, slow, grindy style deck, whether it's Warrior or anything else, just can't beat Shutterwalk because they can't deal with Shutterwalk. They just have to wait, and their opponent survives, and then they cast Shutterwalk, and you're dead. There's nothing you can do. This gives you another slight chance to answer those sorts of decks. So even if you don't kill Shutterwalk itself, you could kill the Grumble, or maybe get rid of both Serenite Chain Gangs. Just do things to disrupt their plan. And of course, it's not just Shutterwalk, it's all kinds of other decks too. And sometimes you're still going to miss all the key components, and you're still going to lose, but this gives you a chance, it gives you a dream, and you're still paying a pretty big price with this symmetrical effect because you're destroying your own stuff too. So it's not like it gives you a necessarily fatigue advantage or anything like that. It's more about just wreaking havoc, sowing chaos, trying to accomplish the otherwise impossible by breaking something that your opponent does, and hopefully not including anything in your deck that is fundamentally important to keep around, because of course you might accidentally blow it up. So I think this is the perfect kind of card to represent the villainy of Dr. Boom, and pretty wild and silly and crazy, and it's something Blizzard never would have done in the past, but more and more we're seeing effects introduced that do disrupt your opponent's deck. So Gnome Feratu, for instance, is one of those. This is essentially a crazy Gnome Feratu, right? It's the same effect, just times 5. And in fact, without a body and with some downside because it destroys your deck. So I don't think this is beyond the realm of possibility for Blizzard anymore. Death Grip is another card that's done the same sort of thing. So I think this is something they might actually do. Maybe it would only be like 3 cards from each player's deck to keep things in check a little bit. But I wanted to go big because this is Dr. Boom. He is the ultimate villain and the centerpiece of the expansion. So this for me is Boom's big red button. Love it or hate it. And there you go, guys. Those are my 8 potential legendary spells. I tried to think of big, crazy stuff, real things that would really change the game. It's honestly very hard. I think these were some of the hardest cards to design of any previous sort of custom card videos I've done, just because legendary spells need to do something big and unique and awesome, but they need to remain, balanced and fair. So really big challenges. That said, of course, I'd love your feedback and your take on these cards. What did you think was good? What did you think was bad? What's overpowered? What crazy combo potential did I miss that's going to break the game? Share all of that in the comments below as always. But until then, thank you so very much for watching, and until next time, game on.